Okay, so welcome everybody to the fifth and final session of this spring series on aging. And our thanks to Pedro, Ken, Wayne, and Nick for their excellent talks as part of the series so far. I'm very pleased to welcome Betony, who's going to give us the recap of the talks. And Betony, as many of you know, holds a master's in physics, a master's in English, and has just submitted her PhD thesis in quantum biology at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Betony assists the Foundation in Scientific Communications and acts as our editor for our series proceedings and indeed for the newsletters. So without further ado, Betony, we're going to ask you to kick off proceedings this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Jeffrey. Jeffrey has given some context for the theme of the spring series. I'll run through the different presentations really briefly to refresh memories before Alistair's talk and the discussion. There was a large amount of information in each presentation, so forgive me if I've left anything out and raise it in the discussion. I've tried to be as accurate to the talks and abstract as possible. Very briefly, the series aimed to explore and expand on research related to the biological phenomenon of aging. It was organized towards understanding basic principles and current theories about aging, and then investigating these in light of insights from the application of physics to physiology and aging. In the first session, Professor João Pedro Magalhães from the University of Birmingham gave us some insights into current directions in aging research. In particular, he discussed aging from the genetic perspective, what genes have been shown to play a role in aging and increase longevity, and how open to manipulation this longevity inheritance is. He also touched on how lifespan varies dramatically between similar species. For example, mice die of old age at 3 to 4 years of age, dogs don't live past 30 years, but humans can live over 100 years. Studies of species with exceptional longevity or disease resistance, like naked mole rats that are resistant to cancer, or bowhead whales that live over 200 years, may help treat and prevent human diseases and pathologies associated with aging. Moving from information to information processing, he outlined how novel research methods might advance longevity research. So systems biology approaches, including network and machine learning approaches, can help predict longevity genes as well as identify new compounds that might be beneficial in the context of aging. For example, one such repurposed pharmaceutical is rolmenadine, which was originally developed as a hypertension treatment. And finally, he suggested that perhaps aging could be seen less as accumulated damage and more as an information problem, a software flaw in the development program that is encoded in the genome and runs in the epigenome. So to better understand aging, he suggested, we need to both decode our genetic software and the flow of epigenetic information. The recognition of the fundamental importance of epigenetic processes led us neatly into the next session, in which Dr. Ken Raj from Altos Labs, Cambridge Institute of Science, discussed the epigenetics of aging and recent development of epigenetic clocks, which are mathematical descriptions that can accurately predict the age of a person based on the degree of methylation on specific positions on their DNA. Ken outlined how the specificity of these age-related methylation changes in genome location and in time in every healthy human being cannot be well explained by random wear and tear. And interestingly, epigenetic clocks function equally in vitro as in vivo and begin ticking during embryonic stem cell specialization. Ken then went into more detail about this distinction between aging due to wear and tear and aging as a dysfunction in cellular programming by linking epigenetic aging to fundamental processes such as nutrient sensing and mitochondrial function. And the universality of these aging processes is strongly supported by the recent development of the universal mammalian clock, which is a single mathematical description that can accurately predict the age of all mammals, regardless of species. Ken then described how clues to the underlying process of aging emerge from the features of the specific gene locations that undergo methylation changes with age. And the sites in question are located primarily in promoters that regulate the expression of genes that participate in the process of embryonic development. And these promoters are bivalent, which means they can promote two opposing modifications on histones, where histones are the proteins around which DNA is wound. One modification stimulates expression, the other modification represses it. And importantly, methylation of these promoters causes loss of this bivalency. And this leads to the loss of the cell's ability to regulate the expression of developmental genes. And consequently, some genes are inappropriately expressed, others can't be expressed when required. And in time, cells, tissues, and organs reduce their efficiency and function, resulting in the gradual aging of the organism. It's widely accepted that exercise is one of the most effective ways in which to guard against age-related degeneration at the macroscopic level. But what does this mean on the macroscopic mitochondrial level at which energy is stored and released? In the third session, Professor Alistair Nunn from the Guy Foundation and the University of Westminster introduced the importance of energy flux balance in the origins and maintenance of stable living organisms. This energy management at the origins of life involved processes of dissipative self-organisation and biosynthesis, followed by the generation of endogenous proton gradients to store energy as ATP. Balance is then kept by the ATPase turbine, which has the benefit that it can also run in reverse to maintain this gradient. Energy flux is thus bound into maintenance of biomolecule structure. Alistair outlined the implications of this, suggesting that movement is not only one way of dissipating energy, but also of maintaining the structural components of organisms, such as proteins. He also outlined how, for some species, including humans, this energy flux through movement may have become canalized to ensure optimal health and robustness, and that aging involves the inability to maintain protein structures with links to mitochondrial function. Physical activity stimulates a healthier population of mitochondria and ATPase throughout the body and slows aging. It broadens our metabolic flight envelope and improves our metabolic engine. This physical activity-induced adaptation is, in essence, the concept of hormesis, implying that movement is essential to maintain protein structure despite aging. In the same session, Professor Wayne Frush from Arizona State University then examined the underlying dynamics of energy flux by focusing on how energy dynamics in mitochondria are affected by age. The primary source of cellular energy in living organisms is ATP, which is synthesized by the protein gradient-driven turbine of the F1F0 ATP synthase. Wayne then outlined the different ways in which this process can break down in mitochondria, specifically in the context of aging. He detailed how mitochondrial fission and fusion are related to longevity, how an age-related decline in mitophagy causes the accumulation of dysfunctional mitochondria, and how mitochondria-derived vesicles can remove damaged elements such as proteins and lipids from mitochondria. He also outlined the structural degeneration of aging mitochondria, such as F1F0 dimer dissociation and changes to the cristae. Wayne had a lot of really beautiful slides showing mitochondrial changes due to aging. The one I chose is just a sample where you can see the age-related changes to the cristae. Wayne also revisited the genetic question, this time in the context of mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA encodes only 13 proteins. Because the mitochondria in an adult derive from those present in the oocyte, mitochondria undergo fission with each cell division, and many devastating neurological diseases derive from these age-related mitochondrial DNA mutations. The cellular aging thus can be delayed by mitochondrial fusion to restore these mild functional losses, and the balance of mitochondrial fission and fusion maintains a healthy organism. To round off the series in session 4, we then had Professor Nick Lane from University College London to think a bit more about aging mitochondria. Nick introduced his thoughts on mitochondria by referencing simpler processes at the origins of life. He outlined how 3 interconnected systems are necessary for cell function. These are energy flow, metabolism, and genetic information, which research is suggesting emerged in that order due to a geochemical proton motive force across cell-like inorganic pores and alkaline hydrothermal vents. He then discussed the ways in which these original processes are preserved in the Krebs cycle, which is the core, as Nick put it, of metabolism. Respiration, which uses the forward Krebs cycle to produce energy or ATP, dominates in an oxygenated world. But the Krebs cycle can also be driven in reverse, fixing CO2 to generate the precursors for cell growth. This mainly happens in bacteria, but Nick discussed how this could happen in eukaryotic cells in the context of cancer and viral infections such as COVID and potentially aging. He also discussed how NADH balance influences whether the Krebs cycle takes an oxidative or reductive pathway, maintaining redox balance. Nick then discussed research his group has done on flies with mismatched mitochondrial DNA, with a focus specifically on complex 1 in the respiratory chain. The work showed that complex 1 function impacts oxidative phosphorylation, but also Krebs cycle flux, intermediary metabolism, gene expression, and phenotypic outcomes, including fitness and longevity. Interestingly, suppression of complex 1 expression can maintain ROS flux within homeostatic limits, even at the cost of viability. He also showed how very small respiratory changes can result in big metabolite differences, though the exact nature of these differences remains unclear. And finally, Nick offered some thoughts on the many open questions raised by these results. He also discussed investigations of the mechanism of volatile general anesthetics in flies, which suggests that complex 1 can act as a supramolecular engine, where synchronized electron flow and proton flux through parallel crystal generates oscillating magnetic fields. These fields are then strong enough to signal to the plasma membrane. Any disruptions in crystal structure with aging are likely to affect the dynamics of this mitochondrial integration within the cell and tissue networks. This was an excellent place to end the series, which began with gene-centered mechanisms of aging and finished with field-based electromagnetic signaling processes, which are very much the focus of quantum biology. And this is the perfect launching pad for Alistair's presentation today, in which he will speculate on what quantum biology and thermodynamics might tell us about aging. With that, let me introduce Alistair. Professor Alistair Nunn is the Director of Science at the Gaia Foundation and visiting professor in theoretical quantum bioenergetics at the Research Centre for Optimal Health, the University of Westminster. He's an active theoretician with an avid curiosity. He has worked in academia, the pharmaceutical industry, and medical communications. And he has published very widely on mitochondria, quantum biology, medicine, phytocannabinoids, metabolic syndrome, aging, space physiology, and the origins of life. Without further ado, Alistair, over to you.
Thank you, Betony. I thought I'd try and talk a little bit about a paper we published 2 or 3 years ago. And this is coming the idea about can we look at life and aging from a slightly different perspective. And I do apologise for the physicists out there. I'm not a mathematician, so some of the terms I might use slightly wrongly. But I hope some of the ideas kind of resonate a bit about what we're doing, and it certainly fits very well with with what we've been talking about this season of talks. Okay, so how we view aging differently, and okay, I use the James Webb here obviously as a hello to Bob, but also because it provides a slightly different view on the universe and the way we view things, and certainly it might provide some insight into what we actually mean by aging, what aging actually is. So what if? What if we can explain aging from the origins of life's perspective? Well, I think this has been covered by quite a few people, including Nick. But if we can view inflammation and hormesis, now you're probably familiar with these terms we've talked about in the past, as flip sides of the same process, but operating at the global scale. Now, I mean, this is like the kind of the Gaia scale. This is looking at the whole world, and where life is the result of a self-organising dissipating process. Where aging is simply like a scale-free expression of a natural selection to main dissipation, i.e. everything's about dissipation. And key in this process could be the loss of how we lose higher order structures to enable rebuilding of simpler structures when under stress. And where maintenance of these structures, and indeed electric fields, and we throw that in well, probably enable significant quantum effects that echo the beginnings of life and self-organisation, retention of information. Now, I'm going to discuss some of these, so don't get too tied up in these, but so basically starting with the thermal vent idea. This is our favourite theory. I know other theories are available, Nick, but I know this is still my favourite theory. And of course, we go through the autocatalytic networks and to network theories and aging. Now, I'm not an expert on these, but I'm trying to bring them together into a format we might be interesting to look at. So let's start with a brief history of life. Yes, I've got the world's expert on this here, so I'll try and keep this brief. But certainly we can say at the beginning there was obviously the laws of the universe and thermodynamics. This seemed to result in an emergent property of the planet to develop autocatalytic networks. And this may well have been started by a big energy gradient between hydrogen and carbon dioxide and seawater, which has been well described. And this seemed to dissipate the energy in the potential. And initially, this was by creating it's a very biosynthetic, creating a lot of molecules. But at some point in evolution, these new life forms potentially learned how to generate their own proton gradients. And this is, of course, this is Peter Mitchell and chemiosmotic theory. Maybe due to stress. We don't exactly know what was going on. Some people know this better than we do. But certainly, at some point during history, we ended up with potentially two kingdoms of prokaryotes, the Archaeans and bacteria. And potentially, I don't know if there was a last common ancestor before that. I don't know if this has been sealed yet, because it's very difficult to go back through time. But certainly what was very interesting, at some point, photosynthesis involved, and one theory suggests this could well have been from the light in thermal vents, but not actually from sunlight, which I think is an interesting hypothesis. Nobody actually knows yet, but certainly involved electron transport. But of course, the big outcome was oxygen. But also at the beginning was quantum mechanics. Must have been there in some shape or form. And quite a few people have been suggesting that, of course, this may well have been very important in the origins of life as well. One suggestion, for instance, and it was one of the things we're quite interested in, is whether or not these early iron sulfide compounds enabled some kind of quantum tunneling in thermal vents. But certainly there's ideas that the quantum mechanics was involved in the formation of early amino acids. And more recently, we're starting to think about, well, is spin and electric fields important in all of this? It's an idea which could explain what we see today. And certainly this ended up with a fully fledged electron transport, and certainly could also be involved in electron bifurcation. So quantum mechanics at some level is certainly important in life. But of course, then after billions of years, we have the love story between bacteria and an Archaean, which ended up with modern eukaryote. How this happened is some debated, but it's a fascinating story. But certainly ends up with all modern multicellular eukaryotic nucleated cells having mitochondria, most of them do, and gives rise to an enormous adaptability where, and as Nicholas explained, we've got the Krebs cycle, which can operate in many different directions, helping keep life going. But one of the things which I've always found fascinating about this is, and I wasn't really taught this in biology, but when I started getting into this and we started looking into this, of course, the idea of tunneling in biology has been around a very long time. Britain chancellors, emphasised this point. So I think it tends to suggest that we've been slightly missing something over many years. So let's move on to self-organisation dissipation. Again, this is just a very simple explanation. How did life start? Well, it seems to be an emergent property of some of the thermodynamics, and Ilya Prigogine, as one of the first people to start talking about this, is how dissipating structures can result in stable, far from equilibrium formations of molecules, which seem to falls out of complexity theory and nonlinear systems. And I'll leave that more for Betony to talk about at some point, because it's not really, it might do. But Schrödinger was kind of thought about this as well. He was talking about the idea of negative entropy. And I apologize here, entropy seems to have several different meanings, but I'm keeping it the simple one. And it certainly seems that this dissipative process can create new order and organization, and is associated with self-reinforcing and balancing processes, i.e. a form of homeostasis. And so it can be viewed that life is a collective autocatalytic system where energy flows in and entropy flows out. And certainly people looked at this and gone, well, this is fascinating. And several authors, including this chap Mike Ellen, have looked at the idea, well, is life simply a way of dissipating potential, in particular, say, for instance, the solar potential? And it also raises a rather interesting point that actually, and this is something we're quite interested in the quantum biology world, of course, this whole idea behind this self-organisation, of course, tends to unify physics and biology, because we have to explain one with the other. And what is really interesting, of course, as we get into electric fields, and of course, electric fields are likely to be created by the created by the movement of charge. And we know these are certainly important in self-organisation, for instance, in carbon nanotubes. And this is a sort of an inorganic process, but actually could apply to microtubules in modern life. So to sort of just simplify it a bit, most of us are probably familiar with self-organising structures, and I always, because I'm interested in flying, I'm always interested in the weather, and certainly hurricanes are an example of self-organisation. You have a huge energy potential because you've got a lot of warm air and water. And hurricanes are a very good way of dissipating that energy through friction, wind, electric discharge, all sorts of things. And in simpler terms, we tend to see this, for instance, when we boil a pan of water, we get these things called Bernard cells, where we get organisation of water where it dissipates the energy. And of course, if you start to think about biology, you start to see some parallels and things, for instance, in dissipation of ion gradients through ion channels. And this led us, directed actually sort of a mixing of some of Nick Lane's ideas and certainly from Mike Levine's ideas to go back to, well, were electric fields really important right at the beginning of life? We got a flow of electrons and a flow of protons. Why not? Was this bioelectric field important? But of course, this relates back to self-organisation. And there's another aspect, which was something I've always found terribly interesting, and it's this idea of uncoupling. And again, biologists will understand all about this. But when we got our proton gradient, and it's always taught in biology, life is very efficient. But actually, when you start looking at it, most life, or nearly all life, is wasting energy. And it's this process of uncoupling. But actually, it happens at all levels. You've got futile cycling, all sorts of things going on. And certainly, it's been used to explain things like redox control. And in, say, for instance, the inner mitochondrial membrane, you have these proteins called uncoupling proteins, which can allow the backflow of hydrogen. And if you've got an over-reduced, say, electron transport chain, that can produce ROS. So this certainly is one mechanism of controlling, say, production of reactive oxygen species. It's certainly important in generating heat. And actually, when you start to think about this, and in general terms, of course, having large fields in the cells is very important for moving proteins around through electrophoresis. So electrophoresis is happening in your cells all the time. And certainly mild uncoupling in many circumstances is associated with improved aging and is anti-inflammatory. We're just saying, I suspect, it's just a way of maintaining a bioelectric field, which of course contains information. So we say uncoupling equals a form of dissipation and holds information. This is just another way of looking at this, and this is just a simple viewpoint. So here, for instance, we have the origins of life, potentially, say, in crystalline structure. We have a flow of energy or ions going through. This could create a field, and we can see that perhaps the interaction with these fields and the molecules and autocatalysis could result in forming more complex proteins, where you have this cycle of energy, information, entropy, and heat going round and round and round, developing and adapting and evolving. So, of course, this kind of suggests, when we start thinking about biology, we've kind of been missing half the story, and this is kind of a quantum aspect. Of course, we all think about chemicals in biology, but actually, fields could be just as important. In fact, just as important as everything else. And of course, this ties in very well with the dissipation and this idea of negative entropy, which is a uniform structure, which evolves out of the need to dissipate energy. So this brings us on to the rather interesting topic of inflammation. Now, what got us thinking about this is what actually is inflammation. Of course, you can go back to Galen and time hundreds of years ago, and people realizing that, if you damage yourself, you get an injury, and it swells and it gets hot and it gets red. Very standard medicine, but it's basically an injury response, and it controls life and death at many scales, several scales. But there's always links to thermodynamics, and as we know, the thermodynamics came from the idea of trying to understand steam engines worked and the Carnot cycle and everything. This led to the whole field of thermodynamics. But of course, there's obvious links to mitochondria. This is the hot mitochondria, and whether or not they really are hot, this thing, but they also dissipate energy. So there's a crossover there. But of course, when we start thinking about medicine and everything, inflammatory tone, as we like to call it, tends to rise with age. And certainly some groups of people, centenarians, seem to be very good at controlling it. And it's well described in the idea of inflammaging. And I think, Nick, you talked about double agent theory, didn't you, many years ago, which is, of course, kind of got them all interested in this. But we know that exercise and calorie restriction tend to be anti-inflammatory, which is, again, telling us something. And the opposite is true. If you live a poor lifestyle, we seem to get this accelerated aging phenotype, which we talked about with space research, because do astronauts develop the same thing? We also know that cancer modulates inflammation in a number of ways. And what's interesting is that, of course, it's a bit of a chicken and egg question, but we know inflammation, for instance, dysregulates proteostasis. And this is the process in biology where cells maintain a healthy population of proteins and, in fact, other organelles and small molecules. But is it affected by ROS? Why do we want to talk about this? Well, I've kind of coined this term: dissipative failure recapitulates phylogeny, or the evolution of aging. And because this is, again, not a new idea, but this was quite a nice paper by Lamoni. It talks about, if we look through history and go back through time and to the earliest forms of life, what did aging look like? And certainly from the various earliest prokaryotes, the suggestion that it's actually due to a failure of chaperone-mediated protein folding. But then we move on to things like histone modification, chromatin modeling. And if these things don't work properly, they seem to be associated with the aging process. We then move on to the eukaryotes, and we start to see things like failure of the proteolytic system. And then we look at failure of maintaining nuclear architecture and the mutation. And we go all that scale up to telomere shortening and everything else. But the key thing here is that loss of protein structure seems to be an indication of loss of ability to dissipate potential, because you lose the structure. So here's another thought. Mentioned in the beginning, we think on the global aspect. Now, this is Gaia, obviously the goddess of Earth and everything. But if we think about a big scale, it could be quite interesting. And the reason for that is, if we think about inflammation, it can be argued that it's a process where it enables a biological system to restore its structure in response to stress. And that stress could be something we call hormesis, but of course they're flip sides of the same thing. If you damage something, it tries to adapt and rebuild itself. And of course, when we look into the sort of theories behind adaptive thermodynamics, this is completely understandable from a dissipative point of view, because you can see through network theory, any of these systems, and the abiotic systems, will try and repair themselves. It's actually fascinating because they adapt. And one of the key aspects to these systems, and it seems that certainly theories are coming out that support this, is that those parts of a system which, for instance, are dissipating and become damaged tend to get removed quite quickly because they can damage other parts. And you could make an argument that, of course, this actually underlies the evolution of, say, the process of apoptosis or programmed cell death. And certainly when I first started looking at this, I didn't really think much more about it. But it now turns out, of course, it occurs in prokaryotes. They can die for the greater good. Now you think, God, that's a single cell, but why is that doing that? Well, actually, when you start to think about this bigger picture, it makes sense because it's an adaptive response. Prokaryotes are not functioning very well, aren't dissipating very well, so you want to get rid of them because it could be damaging. And so you can see that hormesis and potentially inflammation are actually part of the same process. They're just flip sides of the same thing. And this is just to show that if you damage something, you get the system seems to, and it sort of ratchets down through more simplicity so it can rebuild itself into a stronger and more adaptable system. And of course, when it's stressed again, it gets better. And of course, this process can be related to natural selection at very molecular scales. So what do I mean by all this? Well, sorry for this complicated diagram. I have shown this before. But if we think about it on a global scale, and this comes back from this idea again that life is an emergent property of the planet. Planet's the key here. And it could suggest that, of course, we must look at life as a whole. And this is where I'm thinking about the aging process, not just from an individual, but when we look at global life and its perhaps function to dissipate energy potentials. And of course, everything's expendable. And it seems that natural selection operates all the way from the molecular, all the way up to us and beyond. So if we get damaged, and certainly we can see this at the global scale, say meteorite impact, life tends to go backwards a bit and then it readapts and evolves again. And certainly we seem to see that within our own system. So for instance, if we have a damaged protein, the body or the system removes it. Or if we have damaged molecules, we replace it. If we have a damaged organelle, like the mitochondrion, we remove it and replace it. Cells, same thing. If they damage, they die, they get removed, even up to part organs. But of course, we may even see that at the species level. And this is just a kind of way of showing this, of course. So here we have the origins of life. Quantum thermodynamics comes in, we get complex molecules, then we get some ion channels, and we move on to the well-recognized Krebs cycle and the chemiosmosis. Prokaryotes, as we go through evolution, we see plants, dinosaurs became chickens, and of course mammals, which became dolphins and us. And what's fascinating here is really, and if those of you are interested in science fiction, of course, these ideas have been predicted for a long time. And there's a very famous book by Ursula Le Guin called Canticle for Leibowitz. It makes the point that humanity may be going through cycles. Now, we don't think it is, but it suggests that, of course, we get to a certain level of technology and blow ourselves to pieces, and we'll have to start again. There's a certain character we all know who's probably not making that a little bit more likely at the moment. So can we look at this in a slightly simpler way? And I apologize, I'm trying to make it as simple as possible. This diagram basically shows that through evolution, things tend to get more complicated. And cooperative, but actually the idea of cooperation has probably been going for a long time. The actual of this is, of course, an individual organism, as it gets more complex and cooperates better between its individual components, it becomes more robust and it becomes smarter and it can hold more information. And young organisms are very good at this because their systems work really well. And for instance, they manage their electrons well, they can control inflammation well, and they maintain information well. But as they age, they lose this process. And so, of course, when you get to a certain point, say if you get stressed, you actually stop functioning more easily. So you can see that there's like a parallel between what happens on an individual, but also through evolution at species level. So we kind of have to think about life, not just us, but everything. And it seems that damage or severe damage results in simpler structures. And unusual stress in particular can cause us very serious damage. So you can argue that in one way, inflammation, seen at the global level, if it doesn't resolve, it equals a failure to adapt. And so ancient programs are activated, removing damaged structures which don't dissipate properly, so bringing about dissipation. Simple way of looking at this, if we see this is from Darwin's the tree. As we evolve, things get more complicated, and we got to the stage now where some animals certainly, and if you chop up a limb, they can regenerate a limb. It's quite remarkable when you think about that process. And certainly it depends who you are and what kind of animal you are or creature, but this ability varies. But of course, if you throw an asteroid at the planet, it tends to cause species, all these top level species to be wiped out, and it has to re-evolve. But it goes down to the negative. So it's showing this scale process. But of course, this raises another rather interesting point. If quantum mechanics is important and significant in biology, that suggests for this to work, of course, you've got to maintain structure. And so you can argue that aging is actually associated not with a gradual failure of structures, which kind of is suggested, but also with mechanisms to replace them. But critically, the ability to maintain, for instance, the ability to tunnel could be really key. And what's interesting about this, of course, is it's all about electron flow. If the system isn't functioning properly, it starts to signal through ROS, and this induces adaptation. Or if it's too damaging, the system actually tells it to stop working. So scale is key, but of course memory is important in all of this. And I suspect actually, I'm just showing here that this is what happens when we age and mitochondria go dysfunctional. But I suspect Darwin and Wallace will probably understand natural selection, through all the scales here. So what does this all mean for health? Well, you've seen some of these before. If life is a dissipative process, what does it mean for health? Living in optimal health, and this is something we're really interested in, seems to increase the likelihood of an organism maximizing its health span within the constraints of its genetically determined lifespan. Which of course suggests the point, so is disease related to an inability to maintain dissipation, while health is the ability to maintain it. And as you said, centenarians control inflammation well. And so why do calorie restriction and physical activity result in better health? Well, Betony's already explained this quite well. Basically, it's about an energy flux, and it helps in the ability to maintain structure, of course, which is dissipation. So movement is both stressful and dissipative, but we can adapt to it. And therefore, the right amount of energy flux seems to be key in health. So I won't go into more detail on that. And these things we've already shown. Physical activity is really important. There's huge amounts of proof now showing that humans particularly do need to keep moving. Calorie restriction, this is an interesting one. We know that calorie restriction extends life to a certain point. It certainly seems to improve health in humans. We haven't done long enough trials yet. But of course, you can argue that if you're going down, for instance, the route of metabolic dissipation through building, it creates a lot of stress. But if you haven't got enough energy, then it seems to suggest that a structure will maintain its ability to dissipate for longer. And we certainly see this in calorie restriction. We get autophagy and apoptosis, and this is where components of the cells themselves are turned over much more early. And these are cells which are malfunctioning, and they get removed much more quickly. So this goes back to, again, this is adaptive thermodynamics. So coming on to the summary here, well, again, kind of look at it from scale 3. Life relies on the flow of electrons. If it alters, it potentially causes damage and the ability to dissipate. This is a key signal. And this key signal indicates fitness. And of course, this goes back to natural selection, and it happens at all levels. Very dependent on protein and other structures. So if you've got a protein which is starting to not be the right shape, it sends a signal. And potentially start thinking about quantum, it starts to explore, the system can start to explore phase space. It also implies potentially if biology is relying on a quantum state, say we would call it coherence, and this is like a collection of molecules in, say, superposition, If you have the environment intervening on that, it decoheres. And this is a powerful signal. And again, why, for instance, redox is a key signal in all of this. It also explains how maintaining dissipation, for instance, for uncoupling, and the children is key in sensing changes in the environment. This brings us back to the bioelectricity and electron. If you're maintaining this field and ability to dissipate, you can sense the environment very well. You can also hold information in it. And certainly it suggests that the right amount of uncoupling, and certainly some compounds in plants, for instance, do this process seem to be anti-inflammatory, which could suggest this control here. There are other things that fall out of this, and again, this is more of a theory, but one of the interesting things, if you talk about this idea that you're maintaining information, it's been suggested quite a while that hormesis, for instance, mild stress has been key in the evolution of intelligence and cooperation, the ability to outwit your environment effectively. But of course, suggests it's likely to affect behavior. If inflammation affects the system, it can alter the way we interpret the environment. And for a complex organism, it could be argued that inflammation will modulate behavior. Now, we know this, but you could argue it from the dissipating point of view. And we know that inflammation, for instance, is strongly associated with psychological problems, including depression. And a key one here, cytokine-induced sickness behavior. All of us who've been ill will know we don't feel terribly well, and we have this tendency to curl up in a corner. This is a direct effect of inflammation on the brain. But of course, this could be more generalized effect. Is it a higher level expression of the need to remove a damaging unit? And of course, if we can't adapt to our inflammation, we die. And if we don't adapt to the stress, we die. So this has been raised by Skulechev. It's not an accepted possibility, but it is perhaps suicidal ideation, something to do with this process of inflammation where we just tend to move ourselves from the curve. And it's certainly been said that some animals in herds, for instance, if they're ill, it's been suggested that they move themselves away from the herd to protect the herd. Is this a high level expression of dissipation and adaptive thermodynamics? Here's the big one. Is aging adaptive? And this has been fiercely debated ever since Wiseman. You could argue if it ensures entropy, maybe it is on some level. Removal of less functioning units, if they inhibit dissipation, could be one reason, especially if we view life as an emergent property of the planet. Think again, global perspectives. Cancer is potentially a disease of aging. Well, we see it mostly. And I found this paper quite a while ago, is that cancer cells seem to be increase entropy more than that normal cells. But if you modulate them with electric fields, that process reverses. What that's actually meaning, we don't quite know, but it's quite an interesting thing. Suggests something about what cancer is. If an organism ages and the intensity, if it stopped dissipating as much as it could, could there be a trigger here to change the system such that it starts to dissipate again, but cancer is the obvious way of doing it, which of course is not very good in the long run. So, sort of summary here is, if we could view life at the global scale, where every component from the molecule up to entire species is constantly renewing, inflammations and hormesis are flip sides of a global process, and it's to main dissipate energy potentials. And rebuilding requires going back down the complexity scale and then coming back up again, but relies on information. And of course, this goes back to the ideas of Hayflick and the idea that aging really is actually down to the loss of molecular fidelity, where longevity is about the ability to manipulate that and control it. Which of course, and Hayflick used to talk about the idea of genomics, but of course, we now wonder if bioelectricity is important in this process as well, which brings in a whole new way of thinking about this. And it also suggests that programmed death is inevitable, and it operates at all scales, from the smallest to the largest. And of course, stress accelerates turnover and natural selection. And low levels of stress, of course, can engender robustness by selecting through both individual shells or proteins or even species of those which are more able to adapt. And of course, health is about the ability to maintain dissipation. And aging, somewhat paradoxically, is a key process in managing entropy because it ensures the turnover and natural selection. But technology may overcome this, and this is the final point here, which comes back to our old diagram. This is a diagram, or part of it, which we produced many, many years ago, when we were trying to draw a parallel between why it is that people with metabolic syndrome tend to age faster. And I was interested here, and of course, in how's hormesis affect all this? But being somebody interested in space, I thought, well, I wonder if this can answer the Fermi paradox. And the Fermi's paradox is most of you probably know, but it's this idea that Enrico Fermi, many years ago, 1940s, early 50s, This was a time when everybody was looking into space going, gosh, the universe is very, very big. There must be lots of life out there. And of course, Enrico said, well, where is it? Why hasn't it visited Earth yet? Which is, of course, this became Fermi's paradox. And there's all sorts of theories on this. But the theory we've proposed is, of course, through evolution, most of the time we're living in environmental dystopia. We can't manipulate our environment. Basically, we're at the whim of the environment. Of course, this stress induces adaptation. And as we evolve, become more and more able to manipulate our environment. And so humans have got to the point where they actually can manipulate their environment. But of course, in doing so, they remove the very thing that drove their intelligence, longevity, and robustness. And so what we see here is, and I used an alien to show the same thing, but of course, we get to a point where technology comes on board, we think, great, we're doing wonderfully. But of course, it takes away everything that actually makes us robust and strong. But of course, if you start to think about entropy, and entropy in this case is about accelerating the heat death of the universe, when we start out, we wander around and we're one man power or one woman power. When we get horses, we go up. But when we start getting technology, we start utilizing huge amounts of energy. And you think about some of the energy now being used in rockets and things, we colossal production of entropy. But what's rather interesting is at some point, we've now developed artificial intelligence. Now, everybody likes using it, but I would say that if you start having too much artificial intelligence, we stop thinking for ourselves. But the offset of all this is, and this is something which I suspect is, again, something people haven't always thought about, but has been thought about in science fiction. What if artificial intelligence becomes self-aware? Now, this is not a new idea, and it's been talked about. We see this, of course, in HAL out of 2001. We also see it in Terminator, of course, but this idea has been around in many different science fiction stories, and it could go either way. What if artificial intelligence suddenly becomes aware and says, well, humans are the biggest self-destructive power on the planet, let's get rid of them? With that, I shall finish, and we'll move on to the discussion. So thank you, everybody.